King Henry VIII of England is one of the most depicted English monarchs in popular media. One of the reasons that Henry is depicted so much is because he was married no less than 6 times. However, Henry's actions are much more important to the history of Anglicanism, as it would remove the Church of England from papal authority in a quest to secure further power and the succession of the Tudor dynasty. In 1501, a Spanish princess, Catalina de Aragon, better known as Catherine of Aragon, arrived in England to marry the future King of England. This was not the future King Henry VIII, but his older brother Arthur, the Prince of Wales. However, Arthur died within 6 months of the marriage to Catherine. Henry's father, King Henry VII, wanted Catherine to marry Henry. However, one factor interfering in this was biblical law, particularly Leviticus chapter 20, verse 21. And if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless. The English and Spanish crowns sought a papal dispensation to ensure the marriage was canonical. As well, Catherine testified that her marriage to Arthur was never consummated, which was considered a necessity to fulfilling a marriage contract. Catherine and Henry would marry shortly after Henry ascended to the throne in 1509. Catherine was 5 years older than her husband, and for many accounts their marriage was a happy one. However, in more than 20 years of marriage and 6 known births, only 1 child survived to infancy, their daughter Mary. Unlike most European nations, English law did not allow for daughters to inherit the throne in absence of any brothers. However, the Tudor dynasty had only come to power at the conclusion of the Wars of the Roses. Thus, without a clear male heir, Henry could have also worried that another conflict for the throne could occur. Henry sought an annulment of the marriage based on the fact that he had married his brother's widow, which contravened Leviticus chapter 20, and stated that since he had no living sons by his wife, this was proof that God had cursed the marriage. The idea of a king getting his marriage annulled so he could marry a younger wife was not new. Usually, this would be done by showing consanguinity, that is, the bride and groom were related by blood, or there was some other canonical impediment that invalidated the marriage. However, Henry's situation was much more difficult. First, the papal dispensation granted meant that the canonical impediment from Leviticus could be ruled out. Secondly, Catherine was unwilling to have the marriage annulled. Usually, if a king wanted an annulment, he could make financial arrangements with his queen to agree to it, but Catherine would not budge. In 1527, Henry submitted to Pope Clement VII for his marriage to be annulled. There is much evidence to suggest that Clement did not grant the annulment, not because he thought the marriage was valid, but due to political concerns. Catherine's nephew was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who had immense power. Granting the annulment would have not been a wise move at the time for Pope Clement. No one knows whom first suggested the eventual solution to the king's great matter. However, it was not an entirely new concept. Royal supremacy, that is, that kings are God's anointed rulers on earth and answerable to God alone. A more ancient name for this idea is Caesaropapism, where the ruler has total control over temporal and spiritual affairs in his realm. The effect of enacting the royal supremacy did not come overnight. Indeed, the parliament that was summoned in 1529 passed a number of acts over 5 years that effectively chipped away at the bloc. One of the first acts was to force the clergy to pay for a pardon for having allegiance to a foreign ruler, the Pope. He forced the clergy to submit that they were unable to amend canon laws in England without his permission. He stopped further appeals from reaching the Pope, and then greatly reduced the revenues flowing to Rome from the Church of England. However, even after all this, the papacy and Henry were still on speaking terms. In 1533, Henry submitted the name of Thomas Cranmer to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury, and Pope Clement accepted the choice. Shortly afterwards, Archbishop Cranmer and not Pope Clement issued the annulment. This was done after Henry had reputedly already married Anne Boleyn, whom was already pregnant with the future Queen Elizabeth I. Catherine of Aragon then reverted to her former title of Princess Dowager of Wales. She died heartbroken 2 years later, while still believing herself to be Henry's rightful wife and queen. The final act to separate the Church of England from Rome was in 1534. Henry was named supreme head of the Church of England. It became an act of treason, punishable by death, to refuse to acknowledge Henry's position. 2 persons who suffered death for this were Bishop John Fisher of Rochester and Sir Thomas More, Henry's former Lord Chancellor. They were executed in June and July of 1535. John Fisher, who was made a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church shortly before his death, remains the only cardinal in church history to have been martyred. This final act resulted in Clement's successor, Pope Paul III, having both Henry and Archbishop Cranmer excommunicated from the church on the 17th of December, 1538. And thus the English church was finally independent of papal authority. In 1534, Henry authorized Thomas Cromwell, a heavy advocate of reform, to have the wealth of the religious houses throughout England accounted for. At the time, there were over 800 monasteries, abbeys, and priories throughout England at the start of the Reformation. Many of them belonged to religious orders with hierarchy outside of England, such as Durham Cathedral, which also served as a Benedictine priory. These religious communities controlled a great amount of wealth and territory, as well as being the centers of education and power. Cromwell and his associates believed there to be little to no use to the religious houses. In 1536, many of the smaller monasteries throughout England and Ireland had their lands confiscated and sold. By 1540, even the abbeys at Westminster and Glastonbury were dissolved, and approximately 15,000 monks and nuns were displaced. Glastonbury was ruined, while Westminster Abbey, named for St. Peter, was converted into a cathedral for a time. However, its revenues went to fund the cathedral in nearby London, named for St. Paul. This is where the term robbing Peter to pay Paul comes from. A great jewel in the crown of English history was being destroyed. The peasants did not take to the dissolution well. In 1536, 2 separate rebellions occurred in England against the dissolutions and the reforms. The first, in Lancashire, was easily dispersed. However, a much larger one occurred in the north, called the Pilgrimage of Grace. They wished nothing less than to end the reforms and to cease the monasteries being dissolved. The king's advisors, knowing they did not have the troops to which put down the rebellion, made a number of promises to the leaders of the rebellion, such as a parliament to be called at York rather than Westminster to hear out their grievances, and a general pardon for all whom had participated. When, in 1537, none of the promises had been kept, the rebellion started back up, but it was ruthlessly suppressed. After the split with Rome, there was a struggle on what reforms, if any, would occur in the English Church. Advocates of reform held high positions in Henry's court, such as Archbishop Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell. However, a number of pro-Catholics sought to stop any reforms. In 1536, Archbishop Cranmer released what was called the 10 Articles, detailing the guidelines of the doctrine of the Church of England, which left the Church at odds with Protestants in continental Europe. However, these articles were non-binding. In 1539, Parliament was resummoned to deal with church doctrines. Many were discussed, but in the end, consensus could be only reached on 6 points, which became the basis of the 6 Articles. Article 1 affirmed the doctrine of transubstantiation to the exclusion of all other Eucharistic doctrines. Article 2 denied the laity from drinking consecrated wine during communion. Article 3 supported clerical celibacy. Article 4 supported the vows of chastity taken by clerics. Article 5 allowed priests to conduct private masses. Article 6 stressed the importance of oral confession. These articles, which were fully endorsed by the king, were quite a blow to the reformers. Some accounts suggest that Archbishop Cranmer's wife and children had to flee the country for a time. However, given King Henry's history, this was not too surprising. Earlier, in 1521, Henry had penned his pamphlet, Exercitio Septem Sacramentorum, or Defense of the Seven Sacraments, which was meant as an attack on the positions that Luther held. It was this work that earned him the title Fedei Defensor, or Defender of the Faith, from the papacy. He did not authorize any significant changes to the liturgy of the Church, and it remained in Latin. Of all his actions, the most Protestant act he did was to authorize the destruction of the numerous shrines to saints throughout England. These included the shrine to St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral, and the shrine to Our Lady of Washington. Henry died in January 1547, leaving the throne to his 9-year-old son, Edward. Over the next 12 years, the English Church and State would feel immense changes that Henry had attempted to avoid. These changes would be enacted by his children, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, and they would change the course of English religious history forever.